All right, so joining us now, Marc Raimondi, who, ESPN NFL Nation, covers the Atlanta Falcons, but also, obviously, a pro wrestling fan, and his new book is finally out. Say hello to the bad guys, wherever you get your books from. I am looking forward to getting my hands on this. Marc, great to have you on the show again. Has there ever been, now, there have been books on WCW, the rise and fall of WCW. I've read those. Has there ever been a book dedicated to the NWO?
No, there hasn't. This is the first one, and yes, I know there's definitely been books about that era of professional wrestling, and this one is different because I think what I would say is that we kind of use NWO as a vehicle to explain how wrestling, especially during that time period in the '90s, has affected and shaped American culture, and the NWO to me was the catalyst, right? It caused the chain reaction, which led to the Attitude Era, to Stone Cold Steve Austin, to The Rock, and then the incredible popularity of pro wrestling in '98, '99, where they're cutting into the TV ratings for Monday Night Football. I mean, that's just insane to think about, but that's how big wrestling was then, and that's how much it really shaped society.
How did you get the idea to do the book, and how long did it take you?
Took me a while. So it was kind of a convergence of things. So for so long I've been a wrestling fan, right? Like so many of us, I'm a lifelong fan of wrestling, and as an adult, I've kind of looked at wrestling with a different eye, and I've always wanted to kind of express like my thoughts that I see wrestling everywhere. If you understand pro wrestling and what it is, you can kind of like see it in different parts of your life. It really is like, whether it's media or politics or sports, there's so much that's influenced by pro wrestling. Even like Tyrese Halliburton, right? In the playoffs, and he's wearing Degeneration X sneakers. It's like it really is one of those things that encapsulates kind of American pop culture. And I've always said wrestling is everywhere. Everything is wrestling. And then I wrote an article for ESPN in 2019 about the NWO going into the WWE Hall of Fame. And I completely overwrote this story because it was my chance to kind of like put my heart and soul and tell people, especially people who are not fans, like, hey, like keep, put your attention on this. This deserves, some credit for how it has shaped culture. And I overwrote that story, and then a year and a half later, not even considering something like this at the time, I get an email from an editor at Simon and Schuster, one of the biggest book publishers in the world, and the editor is asking me if I want to write a book about the NWO, basically because he saw that article that I wrote for ESPN.com, and he saw that I kind of like put passion into it, and I put kind of a different different level into that story, and that was it. I was like, yeah, I mean, of course I want to write a book about the NWO. It was my childhood. It was a formative time in so many of our lives.
It was your opportunity to show everyone you like, not just that you love pro wrestling, but how cool pro wrestling is.
Yeah, man. That's how I went into it. It was one of those things where you obviously, the wrestling fan, the hardcore fan is certainly a part of the audience, but it was important, especially when you're writing. The publisher is Simon and Schuster, right? This is not a wrestling dedicated publisher. This is a mainstream publisher. This book is going to be, in Barnes and Nobles and Targets and Walmarts. You know what I mean? So it's not just an industry book. It needs to be more than that, and that was what I wanted because I want Laps fans and non-fans to pick this book up, man, and you know, kind of give wrestling its due, its credit for, being the art that it is and being the entertainment form that has had as much impact that wrestling has. I mean, we're talking about who's the biggest star in Hollywood? It's The Rock. He came from wrestling. Who's the president of the United States? It's Donald Trump. He's in the WWE Hall of Fame. Who's one of the biggest musical artists right now? It's Bad Bunny. He's wrestled. He's headlined his own show. I mean, it's like, how can we not start paying attention to this? Let's eliminate the stigma of wrestling. Okay, whatever. It's fake. Sure, whatever that means, right? Not like every other thing that you watch on TV on streaming is not fake, right? Star Wars is real now, okay? So let's eliminate that and let's look at it for what it was and what it is, and that is something that has deeply, deeply been ingrained in American culture for a long time, and the 90s was like the perfect time to kind of explain and showcase that influence.
The NWO is responsible, right, for heels, not just heels becoming cool, but for us as a fan base being allowed essentially to root for the bad guys, right?
100%. And the NWO kind of broke the mold of like wrestling storytelling, because for so long, and obviously there are exceptions to every rule, but for so long, what was wrestling? It was good versus evil, right? Especially in the WWF with Hulk Hogan, and that's kind of fitting because he was he became the anti-hero. He was the hero and he became the anti-hero. And that's what everything was based upon. And the NWO turned that idea on its head, and what they were able to do is make the bad guys, the heels, the protagonists. They were the stars of the show every time they came out. They were the ones that people were paying attention to. It wasn't the big hero babyface like we've seen in wrestling for years and years and years past. It was the guys that had an edge, that were doing bad things, but they were so compelling and charismatic that you wanted to follow along with them and almost root for them, right? In like a primal way, right? You know what they're doing is bad, but they're so entertaining, they're so interesting as characters, and they're cool, they're cool. And as a kid, I was 11 when the NWO started. They were so cool. Wrestling for the most part was not cool, man, at that time, but the NWO was extremely cool, and that really caught on with even like the cool kids at school, right? You had to be watching wrestling to kind of know what was going on with the cool kids.
Do you remember where you were? Can you take yourself back to the first time when you saw Hulk Hogan become the third member?
Yes, I mean, I remember watching it, but I also much more vividly I remember being at a day camp the next morning and I grew up in Queens, New York, and this is day camp in Bayside, Queens, and I remember that everyone was talking about Hulk Hogan turning heel, like the counselors, the campers, like the parents, like it was a really really big deal, like it was really like a cultural like touchstone moment. And it's crazy to think about now because things happen in anything and we're tweeting about it and we're putting it on Instagram and it goes viral and it's all over social media and it's whatever, it's on YouTube. There were none of those things in 1996, for the most part. The internet was kind of a thing, but not anywhere near it was now, and there was certainly no social media in 96, but it was one of those things that went viral before viral was even a thing. It was really just like people picking up their phones, like their landlines at home, and going, "Hey, you guys got to check this out. Hulk Hogan is a bad guy now." It was that kind of you know, cultural zeitgeist that the NWO hit that is very rare to do, and it was even more difficult back then in the 90s.
How deep were you able to dive into the background and how it all came to be that Hogan was the third guy?
Pretty deep. I mean, pretty deep. Eric Bischoff gave me an incredible amount of his time. I flew up to Cody, Wyoming, where he lives. We sat down, we had breakfast, we went to his place, for, to his home there. I met his wife. We sat down for many, many hours, and I was able to pick his brain really about any question that you might have had about the NWO and beyond, right? Because I watched over 500 hours of WCW in preparation for the interview process. So I had a really good working knowledge of what was going on back then, and I was able to kind of gear my questions around that. So I feel like I went pretty deep into details and what was going on behind the scenes and what was going on television as well, and how that all kind of related to each other.
Now, if it wasn't Hogan, like I know Sting was rumored to possibly be
Yeah.
the third member,
Yes.
would we be where we are today with the NWO if it was not Hogan?
No, no, I'm very, very confident in saying that, and for all the reasons that I mentioned before about how cataclysmic that event was when Hogan turned heel. Hogan, it was in '96. He was a household name. He was someone that everyone knew. He was not just wrestling fans. He was in movies, he was in TV, and he was just a guy that he had that recognition, that facial recognition. He was the biggest star in the history of pro wrestling at that point, right? He was the biggest name associated with pro wrestling, but that was like they were synonymous, wrestling and Hulk Hogan. So when he turns heel, it is like it transcends kind of wrestling. It transcends just that one solitary genre, because he is in other entertainment mediums, and he's just incredibly famous. I mean, Hulk Hogan was on the cover of Sports Illustrated in the '80s, and no wrestler has ever done that before, even since then. So he was huge. He was a massive name. So his turning heel was just a different level. If Sting turned heel, I think it would have been a good story. I think it would have been, a nice wrestling story. Would have lasted a few months. I think it would have been entertaining, but no way are we talking about the NWO in 2025 right now if it was not Hulk Hogan as the guy turning heel that night.
How true is it that Hall and Nash, until it actually happened live and in the ring, how true is it that they didn't know for sure how it was going to go that night?
It was true. It was really true. It was no one knew. I'm talking about no one knew that if he was going to do it or not until he got to the building that day. And I'm talking about no one knew. Not even Hulk Hogan knew, because he was on the fence up until the night before, really, or even maybe even that day. Because he flew into Daytona, where Bash the Beach was, and him and his agent went immediately to Kevin Sullivan's home. And Kevin Sullivan was the head of creative for WCW, and he had a home in Daytona near the arena. And Kevin Sullivan's job was kind of like, hey, can you babysit Hulk Hogan for the night and make sure that no one gets into his head and no one starts telling him like ideas about not turning heel? And Kevin Sullivan was up to the task, because, he did end up doing it. But it is extremely true that Eric Bischoff did not loop anyone else in except for the people that really, really, really needed to know, because he was so worried that word would get out, that word would leak, and it would get into the wrestling press, and it would spoil the surprise. And Bischoff was, mortally afraid of that, because he knew what kind of potential, shock and swerve he had with Hulk Hogan turning. And it's true, man. It really wasn't. Hogan really had to think about it, and there were people that did not want him to do that in his inner circle. His ex-wife being one of them, Linda. She did not want him to turn heel.
Is that
His
because of merchandise?
Yeah, I mean, and his agent certainly was thinking about merchandise and movie roles, and that type of stuff, how it was going to affect him outside wrestling, and his wife too. And his wife wrote in her book that when he did turn heel, it became a little bit of an issue for them as a family, because kids at school would go up to their kids, Brooke and Nick Hogan, and be like, and they were like, why is your dad doing this? Oh, your dad's a jerk now, like that type of stuff. So it put a little bit of a stress on the family, believe it or not, to think that it's just an entertainment medium, right? It's just a show, but that's the kind of thing that can happen. But he really was on the fence about it, but ultimately, he made the right move, obviously, right? Because again, who has ever had a career where you can have that level of run as a babyface, where you're the top guy in the entire industry for 10 years, and then have another run where you're, resuscitating the industry 10 years later as a heel? It's pretty remarkable.
How far into the story does the book go?
It goes pretty far into the NWO. I would say the kind of the NWO narrative portion of the book ends in like maybe early to mid 1999, because by then it was the group was pretty much over. After the finger poke of doom, kind of the point of the story, the plot had been kind of lost about the NWO, so it kind of ends shortly after that.
Did you talk to everybody you wanted to?
Almost everybody. Almost everybody. I was happy with who I got, and I interviewed almost 100 people. But the one guy that I did not get that I would have loved to was Hulk Hogan. Obviously, I didn't. I was not able to
Really?
get him. And I tried through many intermediaries, and just didn't. I don't even know if word ever got back to him, but it just never ended up working out, unfortunately.
Why do you think that? Like, if word got to him, why do you think that is that he wouldn't do it?
I don't know. I mean, he's busy. He's got things going on. I don't know. Maybe it's not. It's not. I'm not. The book's not affiliated with WWE, right? He doesn't have that. Behind it. So he doesn't know me from a hole in the wall, I guess, and it's what it is. You don't take that personally. I still interviewed his agent Peter Young, his lawyer Henry Holmes, Jimmy Hart. Obviously a wrestling legend, and his longtime, actual personal manager as well, Hulk Hogan. So I feel like I had the Hulk Hogan perspective in there pretty good, including like some interviews that he did over the years that had not been released before. And I was able to kind of get some of that stuff in there as far as his perspective. So, it happens.
What was the relationship like between the three of them, Hall, Nash, and Hogan?
So it started off being pretty icy. Hall and Nash obviously were good friends, but Hogan coming in as the third guy, and then being like a trio and being like a group, it started off a little bit icy. Hogan didn't know if he could trust them. He was not sure really, how he fit in with that group because they did very much have they had differing styles for sure. They approached wrestling in kind of a different way, and Hogan was kind of a generation behind them as far as like, his age and when he came into the business, and he was still kind of doing 80s things, and Hall and Nash wanted to keep things more current. They were using a lot of like gangster rap references and more recent pop culture stuff in their acts, you could say. And Hogan was not really up to the times as far as that goes. But they did eventually, once Hogan started to trust them, they were able to kind of like show him some of that stuff and explain kind of how they viewed the NWO as far as their vision, how they wanted it to be presented. They started to show him like and have him listen to like, gangster rap and people like that, like Dr. Dre, and trying to get Hogan just on board with kind of what they felt the vibe of the NWO should be. And also, Hogan leaned on them a lot on how to be a heel, especially Scott Hall. And when Scott Hall passed away, that's one thing Hogan said. He gave a speech at his bar in Clearwater, Florida, and he said that Scott Hall taught him how to be a heel. And that was during that process of the NWO, where he had been the biggest babyface in the world ever, for 10 years, and he had to figure out how to be a heel in the mid '90s, and it was not easy, right? And then after kind of like the honeymoon period when was over, where they think they were getting along very well, by like late '96, '97, and then definitely in '98, things got acrimonious again between the three of them. Hall and Nash always stuck together, but especially Nash and Hogan were kind of at each other's throats in '98, and things spilled over, and it almost got violent. It didn't, and they did end up doing business together. But there's a reason why we never saw like a proper Hogan Nash match when it was the Wolfpack versus the NWO Black and White.
Was that the timing of splitting up the NWO, was when they actually had personal problems?
Yeah, and they had problems for a while, but then the tipping point there was when Sean Waltman got fired by WCW. And that was Hall and Nash's best friend, right? And they felt like that was completely a political play and a signal to them that they were not the ones that had the leverage in the company, that they were not the ones that had the political, maneuvering backstage. And it was Hogan that Eric Bischoff was pretty clearly saying that was his guy. He was in Hogan's corner. That was very much a signal to Hall and Nash. They definitely took it that way. And then shortly after that, if you notice, who comes into the NWO? Ed Leslie, the disciple, the former Brutus Beefcake, Hogan's real life best friend. So Hogan brings his best friend back into the fold and brings him into the NWO just weeks after Hall and Nash's best friend get fired. And that was a major, major political like move by them. And Hall and Nash were very pissed off at WCW, at Bischoff, at Hogan, and that almost necessitated the Wolfpack split. It was almost like art imitating life, where those guys really were not getting along behind the scenes, and the group split. Almost in a storyline way, but it was very much imitating what was going on in real life.
What would you say was the moment that the NWO jumped the shark?
That's a hard one because it was to me it was kind of like gradual and then all at once, right? And I'll say Starrcade '97 was kind of like the first chink in the armor. Then after Starrcade '97, and people forget about this, the next
Was
night
that Goldberg Starrcade '97?
that was '98. Starrcade '97 was the debacle of the Sting Hogan finish, where it should have
Oh
been Sting
yes.
going over and finally after all those months, beating Hogan and being the big baby face, representing WCW, big celebration. And it was just we all know the story, right? It was just not well done. And the next night, and people forget this, they had a chance to kind of correct it, to course correct, right? The Starrcade '97 main event finish was terrible, right? The next night, they do a rematch between Sting and Hogan again. And the show goes off the air before the match ends. And they don't play the finish of that match until a week and a half later on the new show, Thunder, the premiere, as basically a ratings ploy for this new show. And I felt like in watching that back, all these fans have been invested in WCW. Now they turned the channel, right? WCW was winning the battle. Nitro was beating Raw. And all those fans made that investment, their time, their money, as far as wrestling goes, into WCW. And then that is what they deliver to the fans. A botched ending in the biggest pay-per-view ever, that main event, and then the next night, instead of trying to kind of patch things up, they made it worse. They made it even more convoluted. So that was a big one for me. And then this is a little bit controversial of a take. I feel like the Wolfpack breaking off also kind of contributed to the gradual death of the NWO. And why I feel that way is because the NWO was always the invaders. Like that was the point. They were trying to take over, and then it just became like a civil war between two NWO factions, and it didn't have that same aura, as popular as the Wolfpack was, and they were over, and I was a fan of them too as a kid, still am, for a lot of those guys, but it was not the NWO storyline anymore. It was just kind of a pro wrestling storyline.
Well, it wasn't NWO versus WCW anymore. Like
correct.
Everyone in WCW was either NWO Black and White or NWO Wolfpack.
Correct. So it became confusing, and you didn't even know who was in what group at that point. And again, as popular as the Wolfpack was, it wasn't. It was a deviation from the original idea of the NWO. Now, what I will say to that is, again, they could have course corrected and made it better, but there was never that. And I mentioned this earlier. There was never that Hogan versus Nash big match. There was never that blow off match until the real moment where I think it really went down the toilet, and that was the finger poke of doom. And if you remember that, I'm sure that you do. I think all wrestling fans know that, where they do tease briefly during Nitro Hogan versus Nash, which is what everyone wanted since May '98, and this was like January '99 at that point. And there is no match. It's just Hulk Hogan poking Kevin Nash in the chest. Nash goes down as if he was shot, and then Hogan pins him, and he wins the title. And it's just like, after all that, after all the fans invested, after all that time of being NWO fans and choosing WCW time and time again over the competition, that is what they delivered to them. And it's just unfortunate. It really is that, it happened that way. And look, hindsight is 2020. They thought they probably had a pretty good idea at that time in '99. Like they thought that was a way to kind of reset the group and get them back together the way they used to be. So in as far as an idea goes, not a bad idea, right? Because that's when it was at its best, when everyone was together and they were that invading group. But the execution left a lot to be desired.
Now, Mark also covers the Falcons, ESPN NFL Nation. So when you're in the Falcons locker room for the first time coming up, next month and a half, whatever it is, are you expecting the players to treat you differently now? They've been seeing you for a couple years in their locker room, and you're the guy who's writing the book on NWO.
I don't think so. I don't think so. I think it'll be business as usual. I'm not expecting anything to change, nor would I want that. But the guys in the locker room are great, and I know at least one of them who pre-ordered the book on Amazon. I won't say who, but I know one of them at least messaged me and said, I'm pre-ordering. I can't wait to read it. So that was pretty cool.
That's awesome. Everywhere you get your books, say hello to the bad guys. I can't wait to get my hands on it. Really, really good stuff. Mark, excellent job. And congrats on the book. It sounds terrific.
Thank you so much for having me, man. I really, really appreciate it.